Picture this: two of history's most profound thinkers, separated by over 2 millennia, sitting across from each other in a dimly lit tavern that exists outside of time itself. The air is thick with the weight of unspoken questions, and tonight, one of humanity's oldest debates is about to unfold. Should we accept the world as it is, flowing with its natural rhythms, or should we rebel against our circumstances and forge our own path through sheer will and determination? The wooden table between them bears the marks of countless conversations, wine stains that tell stories of other great minds who have grappled with life's deepest mysteries. Lao Tzu, the ancient Chinese sage, sits with the stillness of a mountain lake, his weathered hands wrapped around a simple ceramic cup. Across from him, Jean-Paul Sartre leans forward with the intensity of a man who has stared into the abyss of human existence and refused to blink. The silence stretches between them like a taut string, until Sartre breaks it with characteristic directness. "You know, old master, I've spent my entire philosophical career arguing that we are condemned to be free. Every moment, every breath, we must choose who we become. To simply accept the world as it is strikes me as the height of bad faith." Lao Tzu's response comes like water finding its natural course, gentle but persistent. "And yet, my friend, in your very struggle against acceptance, do you not create more suffering for yourself and others? The river does not fight the banks that guide it, nor does the tree rage against the wind that bends its branches." Sartre's eyes flash with the fire of intellectual combat. "But humans are not rivers or trees. We are conscious beings, aware of our situation, capable of transcending it. When I see injustice, oppression, the reduction of human beings to mere objects, how can I simply flow around these obstacles like water? Should the Jews have simply accepted their fate in the concentration camps? Should the colonized simply embrace their subjugation?" The weight of Sartre's words hangs in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Lao Tzu sets down his cup with deliberate care, the small sound echoing in the sudden quiet. "You speak of terrible things, and I do not diminish their horror. But tell me, does resistance born from anger and rebellion ever truly heal the wounds it seeks to address? Or does it merely create new cycles of conflict, new forms of suffering?" "Sometimes," Sartre replies, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who has lived through war and occupation, "suffering is the price we pay for our humanity. To choose authenticity over comfort, freedom over security, rebellion over complicity. The waiter who plays at being only a waiter, the woman who convinces herself she has no choice but to submit to social expectations, they may experience less immediate pain, but at what cost to their essential humanity?" Lao Tzu's weathered face shows the faintest trace of a smile, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "And yet, what if the very act of rebellion, this grasping for freedom you describe, is itself a form of bondage? The more tightly we grasp, the more surely it slips through our fingers. The more we insist on our individual will, the more we separate ourselves from the natural harmony that connects all things." The tavern seems to hold its breath as these two giants of thought circle each other like dancers in some cosmic ballet. Their words carry the weight of centuries, each phrase a stone thrown into the still pond of certainty, creating ripples that spread far beyond this moment. Sartre leans back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the table. "But Master Lao Tzu, your way of acceptance, doesn't it lead to passivity in the face of evil? If everyone simply flows with the current, who will stand up to the tyrants? Who will speak for the voiceless?" "Who indeed?" Lao Tzu responds, his voice carrying depths like an ancient well. "But consider this, the tyrant draws his power from resistance as much as from submission. He feeds on the very rebellion that seeks to overthrow him. What happens to tyranny when it encounters not resistance, but something far more unsettling? The quiet refusal to engage with power on its own terms. The debate has only just begun, but already the air crackles with the electricity of two worldviews colliding. These are not merely academic positions being discussed, but fundamental approaches to human existence itself. The question that brought them here, whether to accept or rebel, suddenly seems less like a simple choice and more like a doorway into the very heart of what it means to be human. Sartre's laugh carries a bitter edge as he signals for another drink. "You speak beautifully of refusing to engage with power, but let me ask you something practical. When the Gestapo knocked on doors in occupied Paris, when they dragged people from their homes, what good was quiet refusal then? Sometimes, Master Lao Tzu, the world demands more than philosophical elegance." The ancient sage nods slowly, acknowledging the pain behind the words. "I do not speak from ignorance of suffering, my friend. I have seen empires rise and fall, witnessed the endless cycles of violence that human ambition creates. But tell me, in your experience of occupation and resistance, did the violence end with victory? Or did it simply transform into new forms of domination? Of course the struggle continues, Sartre replies, his intensity building like a gathering storm. That's precisely the point. Freedom is not a destination we reach and then rest upon like some comfortable chair. It's a constant process of becoming, of choosing ourselves again and again in each moment. The moment we stop choosing, stop rebelling against the forces that would reduce us to mere things, we cease to be fully human. Lao Tzu's response flows like oil on troubled waters. But what if this constant struggle, this endless becoming you describe, is itself a form of suffering? What if freedom is not something we must fight for, but something we already possess when we stop fighting? The bird does not struggle to fly. It simply extends its wings and trusts in the air that supports it. Birds don't write philosophy books or run concentration camps, Sartre shoots back with characteristic sharpness. They don't face the burden of consciousness, the terrible weight of having to choose not just what to do but who to be. A bird's nature is given to it by instinct. Human nature, if it exists at all, is something we must create for ourselves. The conversation takes on the rhythm of waves against stone, each philosopher's words wearing against the other's certainty. Lao Tzu speaks again, his voice carrying the patience of flowing water. You say we must create our nature, but creation itself follows certain patterns, certain ways that cannot be forced. When a gardener plants a seed, does he create the flower through struggle and rebellion? Or does he simply provide the conditions for what already exists in potential to unfold naturally? Sartre's eyes narrow with the focus of a hunter tracking dangerous game. But that analogy assumes we are like seeds, with some predetermined essence waiting to unfold. I reject that completely. We are not seeds but sculptors, and we are both the sculptor and the clay. We must carve ourselves from the raw material of existence without any blueprint, without any guarantee that our choices will lead to anything meaningful or good. And therein lies your suffering, Lao Tzu observes with gentle precision. You have made yourself responsible for everything, the sculptor of your own existence, the author of your own meaning. No wonder you speak of being condemned to freedom. You have transformed the greatest gift into the heaviest burden. The weight of this observation settles between them like dust after an earthquake. Sartre falls silent for a moment, perhaps recognizing something in Lao Tzu's words that strikes closer to home than he would like to admit. When he speaks again, his voice carries a vulnerability that wasn't there before. But what's the alternative? To pretend that we're not responsible for our choices? To hide behind fate or divine will or the natural order? I've seen too many people use such ideas to justify their cowardice, their willingness to collaborate with evil, because they claim they have no choice. Lao Tzu's response comes with the warmth of sunlight after rain. I do not speak of avoiding responsibility, but of understanding its true nature. When you try to carry the weight of the entire world on your shoulders, you become too heavy to move effectively. But when you understand your place in the greater flow, you can act with precision and power that comes not from force, but from alignment. Their debate has moved beyond mere philosophical positions into something more personal, more revealing. In Sartre's insistence on rebellion, one can hear the voice of someone who has refused to be broken by circumstances. In Lao Tzu's call for acceptance, there is the wisdom of someone who has learned to work with forces greater than individual will. Yet neither man seems willing to concede ground to the other, and the tension between their worldviews continues to build like pressure in a sealed vessel, promising explosions still to come. The tavern's atmosphere grows heavier as the night deepens, shadows dancing in the flickering candlelight like thoughts refusing to hold still. Sartre runs his fingers through his hair, a gesture betraying the frustration of a man accustomed to cutting through philosophical fog with the sharp blade of logic. Let me try a different approach, he says, leaning forward with renewed intensity. You speak of alignment with natural flow, but nature itself is often cruel, indifferent to human suffering. Should we align ourselves with cancer, with earthquakes that bury children, with the strong preying upon the weak? Your acceptance begins to sound dangerously close to moral relativism. Lao Tzu's eyes hold depths like still pools, reflecting starlight. You mistake acceptance for approval, action for struggle. When flood waters rise, the wise person does not fight the current, but navigates skillfully to higher ground. This is not approval of the flood, but intelligent response to reality. Fighting the water directly leads only to drowning. But we're not talking about floods. Sartre insists, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who has seen too much human cruelty. We're talking about human choices, human institutions, human evil. A flood has no consciousness, no moral agency. But when a human being chooses to oppress another, when systems are created to crush the spirit, surely we cannot simply navigate around them as if they were natural disasters. The ancient philosopher's silence stretches like a held breath before he responds. Tell me, Jean-Paul, in your years of resistance and rebellion, how many tyrants did you overthrow? How much suffering did you eliminate? And of the victories you achieved, how many led to new forms of tyranny wearing different masks? Sartre's jaw tightens, the question hitting closer to home than he anticipated. Change is slow and imperfect. That doesn't mean we should stop trying. Every act of rebellion against oppression, even if it fails, affirms human dignity. Even if I save only one person from the camps, even if I preserve only one moment of authentic freedom, it's worth the struggle. And yet, Lao Tzu continues with the persistence of water-wearing stone, your very rebellion often strengthens what you fight against. The tyrant points to the rebel and says, see how dangerous freedom is, see why you need my protection. The rebel's violence justifies the tyrant's violence. The cycle continues, fed by the very nobility of your intentions. Sartre's response comes like lightning splitting the darkness. Then what do you propose? That we simply meditate while evil runs rampant? That we find inner peace while others suffer? Your way of wu-wei, your non-action, it's a luxury available only to those privileged enough to withdraw from the world's struggles. For the first time, Lao Tzu's composure shows a crack, a flicker of something deeper and more complex than serene acceptance. You misunderstand wu-wei profoundly. It is not inaction, but right action. Action that flows from understanding rather than from anger, from wisdom rather than from ego. The master swordsman defeats his opponent not through force, but through perfect timing, perfect positioning, perfect understanding of the moment. Philosophy is not swordsmanship, Sartre counters, but his voice has lost some of its edge, as if he senses something in Lao Tzu's words that deserves closer examination. Human suffering demands immediate response, not perfect timing. While we wait for the perfect understanding you describe, people die. Lao Tzu nods, acknowledging the weight of this truth. Yes, people die. They die in wars fought for justice, and they die in the peace that follows those wars. They die in revolutions that promise freedom, and they die under the new rulers those revolutions bring to power. The question is not whether people will suffer, for suffering is woven into the fabric of existence. The question is whether our actions increase that suffering or diminish it. The two philosophers sit in momentary silence, each weighing the other's words against the backdrop of their own experience. The candle between them flickers, casting shifting shadows that seem to mirror the complexity of their debate. Sartre speaks first, his voice quieter now, more reflective. You may be right that rebellion often creates new forms of oppression, but surely you must admit that passive acceptance can enable even greater evils. The good person who does nothing while evil flourishes bears some responsibility for that evil's continuation. Indeed, Lao Tzu agrees, with surprising readiness. But who decides what is good and what is evil? And once that decision is made, who decides how to respond? Your existentialism places this burden squarely on the individual consciousness, making each person responsible for choices they cannot fully understand, in situations they cannot completely control. The observation hangs in the air like incense, sweet and slightly unsettling. Both men seem to recognize that they have reached one of those moments where the ground shifts beneath seemingly solid philosophical positions, revealing depths neither anticipated when the evening began. Sartre's fingers trace patterns on the wooden table, as if writing invisible equations for human freedom. The weight of Lao Tzu's last observation settles around him like a heavy coat, and when he speaks, his voice carries the weariness of someone who has carried impossible burdens for too long. You're asking me to question the very foundation of everything I believe, he says, not accusingly, but with the wonder of someone discovering an unexpected depth. If individuals cannot be fully responsible for their choices because they cannot fully understand the consequences, then where does that leave us? Are we all just leaves blown by winds we cannot see or comprehend? Lao Tzu's response comes with the gentleness of a father speaking to a troubled child. Not leaves, but dancers learning to move with music too vast and complex for any one dancer to hear completely. The wise dancer does not try to control the music, but learns to feel its rhythm, to sense its direction, to contribute their unique movement to the greater dance. But that metaphor assumes the music is beautiful, Sartre objects, though his voice lacks its earlier fire. What if the music is discordant? What if the dance itself is violent, crushing those who cannot keep up? In my experience, the universe provides no moral guidance, no inherent meaning. We are alone with our choices, abandoned by any god who might have once offered direction. The ancient sage's smile returns, soft as dawn breaking over mountains. Abandoned or freed? You speak of being condemned to freedom as if it were a punishment, but what if freedom is precisely the gift the universe offers? Not the freedom to control everything, but the freedom to respond with wisdom rather than react from fear. Sartre laughs, but it's a different sound now, less bitter and more puzzled. You have a way of turning my arguments inside out, old master, but tell me this. If we should respond with wisdom rather than react from fear, how do we know what wisdom looks like? How do we distinguish wise action from clever rationalization? Through stillness, Lao Tzu answers immediately. Through learning to quiet the constant chatter of the ego that insists it knows what should happen next. When the mind becomes like a clear pool, it reflects reality without distortion. In that clarity, right action arises naturally, not from rules or ideologies, but from direct perception of what the moment requires. Stillness. Sartre repeats the word, as if tasting something foreign. In occupied Paris, I learned about the necessity of choice under pressure. When seconds might mean the difference between life and death, between collaboration and resistance, there's no time for meditation, no luxury of stillness. Action must come from commitment, from the willingness to act without certainty. Lao Tzu leans forward slightly, his attention sharpening like a bird focusing on distant movement. But what if the commitment itself arises from stillness? What if the capacity to act decisively in crisis comes not from ego's frantic planning, but from deep trust in one's ability to respond appropriately when the moment arrives? The question hangs between them like a bridge neither is quite ready to cross. Sartre stares into the depths of his drink, as if seeking answers in the dark liquid. When he looks up, his expression has shifted into something more vulnerable than his usual intellectual confidence. I've built my entire philosophy on the premise that we must choose without knowing, must act without certainty, must create meaning in a universe that offers none. You're suggesting there might be another way, aren't you? A way of knowing that doesn't depend on rational analysis or willful determination. I suggest only that you consider the possibility, Lao Tzu responds with careful precision. The way of the Tao is not about replacing one belief system with another, but about discovering what remains when all belief systems are set aside. What capacity for appropriate action exists when the mind is not cluttered with preconceptions about what should happen? Sartre's next words come slowly, as if he's thinking aloud rather than making an argument. But without preconceptions, without commitments, without the willingness to say this is right and that is wrong, don't we risk becoming morally neutral? Don't we abandon our responsibility to take sides in the great struggles of our time? Or perhaps, Lao Tzu suggests with infinite patience, we discover a way of taking sides that doesn't require us to become enemies of those on other sides. Perhaps we find a way of standing for justice that doesn't depend on hatred of injustice, a way of serving life that doesn't require us to make war against death. The candle flickers again, sending shadows dancing across both faces, and in that movement, something shifts in the atmosphere between them. The debate that began as a clash of worldviews is transforming into something more collaborative, more exploratory. Neither man has abandoned his position, but both seem increasingly curious about what might lie beyond the boundaries of their familiar territory. The silence that follows Lao Tzu's words feels different from the earlier tensions, more like the pause before dawn than the quiet before a storm. Sartre sits back in his chair, and for the first time since their conversation began, his shoulders seem to release some of their burden. You know, he says with something approaching wonder in his voice, I've spent decades arguing with religious believers, with Marxists, with anyone who claimed to have found some external source of meaning or direction, but you're offering something I hadn't considered, a kind of knowing that doesn't claim to know, an action that doesn't grasp for control. Lao Tzu's eyes twinkle with gentle humor. The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon itself. All philosophical systems, including my own, are merely fingers pointing towards something that cannot be captured in words or concepts. The danger comes when we mistake the finger for the moon, when we become attached to our particular way of pointing. But surely some ways of pointing are better than others, Sartre insists. though his voice carries more curiosity than argument now. Surely the finger that points toward human dignity and freedom is preferable to the finger that points toward oppression and cruelty. Indeed, Lao Tzu agrees readily. But notice how your language reveals your assumption. You speak of freedom and oppression as if they were fixed destinations rather than dynamic processes. What if freedom itself becomes a new form of prison when we grasp it too tightly? What if our very insistence on human dignity sometimes denies the complex, messy, undignified reality of being human? Sartre's laugh this time carries genuine delight. You're incorrigible. Just when I think I understand your position, you dissolve it like mist. Are you saying that even freedom and dignity are traps? Not traps, Lao Tzu clarifies with infinite patience, but like all concepts, they can become obstacles to direct experience if we hold them too rigidly. The person who insists on being free may miss opportunities for meaningful connection that require some surrender of independence. The person who demands dignity may reject the humble, ordinary moments where real wisdom often appears. The conversation has taken on a rhythm like music now, each voice building on the other rather than simply opposing. Sartre finds himself nodding slowly as he considers the implications. So you're suggesting that my rebellion against the world might itself be a form of attachment, a grasping for how things should be, rather than a wise response to how things actually are? I'm suggesting nothing, Lao Tzu replies with a smile that somehow manages to be both mischievous and profound. I'm simply holding up a mirror and asking what you see reflected there. The question is not whether rebellion is right or wrong, but whether it arises from wisdom or from the ego's demand that reality conform to its preferences. Sartre runs his hands over his face as if trying to physically process this new perspective. But if we abandon the ego's demands entirely, if we stop insisting that things should be different than they are, don't we risk becoming passive in the face of genuine evil? Don't we lose the very spark that makes us human? Or perhaps, Lao Tzu suggests gently, we discover a more effective way of responding to evil, one that doesn't depend on hatred or anger, or the assumption that we know exactly how things should be different. Perhaps we find a way of action that comes from love rather than fear, from understanding rather than judgment. The word love hangs in the air between them like a bell that has been struck. Sartre stares at the ancient philosopher as if seeing him for the first time. Love, he repeats slowly, not the romantic sentiment, but something larger. The capacity to see clearly without the distortion of personal agenda, to act from care rather than from the need to be right. Lao Tzu nods approvingly. When the heart is open and the mind is clear, appropriate action arises naturally. Not passive, not aggressive, but responsive to what each unique situation actually requires. Sometimes this might look like rebellion, sometimes like acceptance, sometimes like something altogether unexpected. You're describing a way of being in the world that transcends the choice between acceptance and rebellion, Sartre realizes with growing excitement. A way of responding that's neither passive nor reactive, but creative in ways I hadn't imagined possible. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, Lao Tzu quotes himself with gentle humor. The moment we try to capture this way of being in concepts or rules, we've lost it. It must be discovered fresh in each moment, through direct engagement with life as it actually is, not as we think it should be. As their conversation moves toward this unexpected convergence, both philosophers seem surprised by how far they've traveled from their starting positions. The debate that began with seemingly irreconcilable differences has revealed a deeper territory, where apparent opposites might dance together rather than fight to the death. The candle has burned low, its flame dancing smaller now but somehow more intense, as if concentrating its light for these final moments. Both men sit in contemplative silence, each processing how profoundly their conversation has evolved from its combative beginnings. Sartre breaks the silence first, his voice carrying a quality of reflection that would have seemed impossible hours earlier. I'm beginning to wonder if our entire debate was based on a false premise. We've been arguing about whether to accept or rebel, as if these were the only two options available to conscious beings. Lao Tzu nods slowly, like a teacher recognizing a student's breakthrough moment. Perhaps the very question, should we accept the world or rebel against it, assumes a separation between ourselves and the world that doesn't actually exist. If we are part of the world, not separate from it, then our actions are the world acting through us, not us acting against the world. That's a profound shift in perspective, Sartre admits, leaning forward with renewed intensity. Instead of seeing myself as isolated consciousness thrown into an alien universe, I might consider myself as the universe becoming conscious of itself, taking responsibility for its own evolution. The ancient sage's eyes brighten with appreciation. Yes, and from this perspective, your rebellion against injustice and my acceptance of natural flow need not be contradictory. They might be different expressions of the same fundamental care for life, the same desire for harmony and well-being. Sartre's excitement grows as he follows this thread. So when I rebel against oppression, I'm not fighting against reality, but helping reality move toward greater freedom and authenticity. And when you accept what is, you're not being passive but aligning with forces that naturally tend toward balance and harmony. Exactly, Lao Tzu confirms with a smile that seems to illuminate the entire tavern. The question becomes not whether to accept or rebel, but how to discern which response serves life most effectively in any given moment. Sometimes reality calls for fierce resistance to forces of destruction. Sometimes it calls for patient acceptance of processes that cannot be rushed. The realization settles between them like the warmth from a fire finally catching hold. Sartre shakes his head in wonder at the journey their conversation has taken. You know what strikes me most about this? He says. We haven't solved the original question so much as transcended it. We've discovered that the question itself was limiting our vision, forcing us to choose between partial truths instead of seeking a more complete understanding. Lao Tzu chuckles, the sound like water flowing over smooth stones. The wise person asks better questions rather than finding better answers to poor questions. Instead of, should we accept or rebel, we might ask, how can we respond most skillfully to this moment? Or, what does life require of us right now? And those questions, Sartre realizes with growing clarity, can only be answered through direct engagement with reality, not through abstract philosophical principles. They require the kind of presence and attention you've been describing, the ability to see clearly, without the filter of preconceptions. The conversation has brought them to a place neither expected when the evening began. The fierce intellectualism that characterized their early exchanges has softened into something more collaborative, more exploratory. They sit now not as opponents, but as fellow travelers who have discovered unexpected common ground. Perhaps, Lao Tzu suggests gently, this is how all apparent oppositions might be resolved, not by choosing one side over the other, but by discovering the larger reality that includes and transcends both sides. Sartre nods thoughtfully. The synthesis that emerges from thesis and antithesis, but not through logical argument alone, through lived experience, through the willingness to remain open to possibilities we hadn't considered. As the candle flickers one final time before extinguishing itself, both philosophers sit in a darkness that feels more like completion than ending. Their debate about accepting versus rebelling has revealed something more fundamental, the human capacity to grow beyond the limitations of any single perspective, to find wisdom in the spaces between opposing ideas. Well, old master, Sartre says into the gentle darkness, I came here tonight prepared to defend rebellion against acceptance. I leave with a deeper appreciation for the rebellion that comes from true acceptance, and the acceptance that makes effective rebellion possible. Lao Tzu's final words float through the darkness like a blessing. And perhaps that is the most rebellious act of all, to refuse the limitation of choosing sides when the moment calls for embracing the fullness of what it means to be fully human. The debate that began with such fierce opposition ends in a recognition that the deepest truths often lie not in choosing between alternatives, but in discovering the creative possibilities that emerge when apparent opposites dance together in the vast complexity of existence itself.